Okay, I think the room is filling, so let's start right away. Let's start by introducing myself. My name is Christian Rakosch. I'm chairman of the World Bioenergy Association. And today in this webinar, we want to talk about building supply chains for bioenergy commodities. We will be talking mainly about solid biomass today and what is needed to build successfully supply chains. I should add that, usually bioenergy supply chains are local supply chains. Like in Europe, for example, I think something like 93% of all the bioenergy that is being used in Europe, all the solid bioenergy, is basically sourced in Europe. But there is, of course, also scope for international trade and large scale bioenergy supply chains, which play a supplementary role and a role for specific users, for example, for users that need very large volumes of biomass at the same time, and that can be more easily supplied through international supply chains that basically go across oceans than by land-based supply chains. And that can also take, of course, advantage of particularly beneficial growing conditions, large biomass resources that would otherwise not be usable in the context where they are growing. So regardless if we're talking about local supply chains or international supply chains, the key elements of establishing biomass supply chains to establish biomass as a source of reliable energy supply are always the same topics. It's about the sustainable sourcing of biomass that is the primary precondition to start off with. It's about managing logistics, about upgrading, about efficient upgrading, about logistics to the user, about quality management, management of safety, management of supply security. There are really a lot of aspects that are relevant. And of course, we're not going to be able to touch all of these, but I'm very glad and very proud to have three really excellent and internationally recognized experts on the subject today in this webinar. It is Thomas Meth, who has served as president of Enviva for basically since, well, as one, he was one of the founders of Enviva, let's put it this way. Martin Gnoth, who is consultant with many years of experience in the sector, and Dizit Balais, who is also a seasoned expert in biomass trading and also in international and national trade organizations. So just two more words before we start. If you have questions, there is a chat function. Please bring in your questions in the chat, and we will ask the presenters right after their presentation. So if you have a question, put them into the chat, and we will be asking these questions. Now let's get right into it. Thomas, I think it's correct to say that you have been building the largest international supply chain with solid biomass worldwide. You have been doing so over, well, how many years, Thomas?
20 years.
Jesus. So it was a long-term project. When you started, what was the point of departure? Where did you start from when you engaged in building up Enviva, basically from scratch?
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's a good question. It's a great question to start. Just for me personally, a quick editorial comment to all the audience, because I'm in the middle of transition, quite literally. My last day with Enviva was actually on Friday. And tomorrow, I'm going to start as the head of biomass for Javelin Commodities, one of the largest commodity traders in the world, to build another biomass supply chain. They ship 70 million tons of different forms of commodities, and a lot of the customers want renewable alternatives. And so this has been a long time coming. So it's not a surprise to me, but wanted to start there. And the journey for Enviva had lots of great moments and had some downs, and we can talk a little bit about what went right, what I think are good lessons around this. I will caution everybody that in America we have a saying: hindsight is 20/20. Or if you're German speakers like Christian and I, because my mother lives about 5 minutes from his house. Im Nachhinein ist man immer gescheiter. And there are other versions of that, of course, in different languages. But I think let's start with the history. So 2004 rolls around, and three people in the United States are really interested in biomass. We stumbled upon it when we all got an MBA together, and we felt like that a renewable hydrocarbon, if we didn't call it that at the time, but that was something that was underutilized. The scale of all these production facilities in 2004, think about it, they were really, really small. And so if you are a large user of biomass, you had to go through an extremely fragmented market of suppliers. None of those suppliers had any credit. A lot of these suppliers didn't have any expertise, and we felt like there was a real void, right? If you're an entrepreneur, you feel like we felt like we had an unlimited market opportunity, but there was not any sort of large scale or really relevant supply chain at that point that was built. We started like what Christian just talked about, which was local biomass, right? So you have projects that need biomass, and then you figure out how to accumulate and aggregate that biomass locally. And you do find your limits, how much you can aggregate locally. So if you have a small demand opportunity, well, then local biomass is probably good enough. But we had big aspirations, and the customers who we tried to serve had big aspirations, and they didn't need thousands of tons; they needed hundreds of thousands of tons. We started building combined heat and power plants in different parts of the U.S. We built them in the Dominican Republic and Honduras, and it was all local biomass. And we had two pellet plants in 2007 and 2008. One in Belgium, one in Germany, and got to know some of the utilities in Europe who started to dabble into co-firing because these pellet plants were actually serving the domestic market, the market Christian spent a lot of his life building. But that market even today has a bit of a flaw, which is then in the summer often it's really hard to find the demand, right? Storage isn't really there. So when we were in that market 7, 8, 9, 10, we had to find users in the summer that were not in the domestic market. And so from Straubing, Germany, and in Belgium, we went to Electrabel in Belgium. We didn't make any money doing that, but we established those relationships. And at some point with RED 1, some of these utilities like Electrabel started to think about how do we turn the usage of biomass from something that's totally opportunistic into a strategy. And Electrabel approached us and said, Thomas, how do we think about getting biomass, not on an opportunistic basis, but rateable on an everyday basis? We need 500,000 tons a year, but we need like a ship every 5 weeks. So the domestic market in Europe was clearly not going to be the place to go. And we were already based in the US anyway, and what had happened since the 90s was that the paper industry dramatically reduced its usage of wood, pulpwood, and offcuts from the forest. And we thought there's a really good opportunity to step into that void. And we signed a long-term agreement with Electrabel as Enviva, and started building larger scale pellet factories in the US, and we put our plant literally where the paper mills just shut down. So that contract started in 2010, and then it got large scale quickly. We signed in 2011 a 1 million ton 9-year agreement with Drax, and built some more facilities. And when it was all said and done today, Enviva manufactures is about, well, there's one plant still needs to be finished in Epes, Alabama, but with that, about 6 million tons of product a year. And so that I believe is the largest, at least in the pellet world, supply chain that's been built, and still serves predominantly the power and heat customers in Europe and Asia.
What, Thomas, if we have usually a very wide audience of people around the world, and some of them may be thinking about getting into this. What are the key aspects a project developer should kind of focus his attention on if he thinks to do something like you did, build up a supply chain, whether it is for a local or an international customer, and get this going? I mean, there is just an incredible amount of biomass that is still wasted today around the world. So, what would you recommend to such a person?
Great question, Christian. And the stars that we get create the philosophies around what I would consider important. I just caution the audience that what I'm going to tell you is my experience, is not the truth. I think there are various ways to find your way to Rome, but I think a couple of things that we've learned for sure. I would start, of course, with the wood, and I'll go through all the supply chain elements. So our first pellet plants were sawdust related and dependent, and the 2007, 2008, Christian, you probably remember this, was not a great time for sawdust. Actually, today is probably not a great time for sawdust. Every time we have a little bit of a downturn, I mean, in the US, you see a dramatic downturn in sawmilling residues, and so you're on a 100,000 ton pellet plant in Germany, and all of a sudden your sawdust is really hard to come by and costs twice as much. But the market has not caught up. So we had a rule that we were still using shavings and sawdust in all of our plants, but we never wanted to depend on that. So we started every plant that we built with, what happens if there's an economic downturn and sawdust goes down? How do we feed the mill? And the strategy was always based on, it was independent of the cycles of wood supply and the housing market. That was one of the greatest decisions we've ever made that worked. Wood prices change, but you never run out of wood, and the wood costs are not double. They're maybe 20% higher. So that really worked. The second thing we learned was that if you find this miraculous biomass source that's really, really cheap in the short term, people will figure this out. We've always seen this in the waste side of things. If it feels like a waste today, be careful, because in 2 or 3 years, somebody's going to pay more for it than you have in your business plan. There are no miracles in this space. If it has calorific value and is pretty clean, eventually somebody else will come find it. So if you build your business plan on some assumptions that depend on the fact that you found something that only you have your hand on, and it's unusually cheap, that's a careful premise. And investors have gotten burned on that time and time again. The supply chain needs to be sustainable, and sustainable can mean all sorts of things. But there are some elements in sustainability that you can't win. And so, for example, for us, we built two of our plants in an area that had very sensitive bottomland hardwoods. And from a definition perspective, you can of course say it's all sustainable, but from a public perception perspective, hard to win that. So I wouldn't build those plants in the same spot anymore. The same is true probably for primary wood that's 200 years old. You're gonna run into some issues where you're in the middle of a lightning rod issue with the NGOs. And so I would urge everybody to avoid those unless you feel the urge to be a lightning rod in this industry. I've served at that. It's really time consuming and not always pleasant. It's certainly not fair. But it's much harder to attack sawmill residues and pine pulpwood. And so those are my major highlights on. There's one more thing. I think when I think about the future, our respective customers will want to know where the wood is coming from. So Enviva built a track and trace system where for every truckload, the firm has the GPS coordinates and can track it back to the source. And in fact, has created an approval process that before we take the wood, we check whether there are some, sensitive areas the wood's coming from. That is absolutely the future. Whether it's the regulators, whether it's the Microsofts or the Amazons in the world, you'll have to figure out a way how to satisfy the need for regulators and sensitive consumer-driven customers to be able to check whether deforestation happens or can happen, and if it does, give an opportunity to rectify the situation. I think those are the highlights on the wood supply chain. Let's go further upstream and let's talk about production. The most difficult thing about production in biomass is that often, it's a low margin business. So these plants have to run, 85, 90, 95% of the time. And generally the plants that we've built did that. But of course, through the pandemic, there were times when it got difficult. And it got difficult through the supply chain disruptions on spare parts. So there was a bit of a perfect storm at times. But what I have found is that not every place in the world is the same. If the local workforce and the qualifications of the local workforce, I think in retrospect, we've underestimated. We have some places where you have an incredibly loyal workforce, the schools are good, and people move there if you ask them to move there. And then there are other places where the schools are not good. The climate is not great. It's really remote. And unless you have people there who are loyal, getting people to move there is very, very difficult. So we found because of that sometimes the turnover in some places, despite the fact that the plants are identical, is in an entirely different league. And with that, the cost position of that plant is much, much higher. We found technically that advancing technologies is absolutely something we've gotten smarter. But the flip side of that is if something hasn't been done before, there's generally a really good reason for that. And I do find a lot of developers, and I'm working with many now because I'm building now for a different firm, another supply chain. And the one caution I have is in this business, if you want to be successful, the first character trait you have is humility. Because if you think that you're smarter than everybody, you're gonna lose. Because there are incredibly smart people around it, but this business is not easy, right? And so learning from each other, be constructive about this. This is really, really helpful. More broadly in operations, I think this industry is still at an early stage when it comes to safety standards. And I can only encourage every single one of the people in this industry to just put your best foot forward, right? Like insurance rates in this industry have gone up a lot, right? Not just because of safety incidents with people, but we have had all over the place fire incidents over the years, and that has created a lot of learnings. But we really don't have a good platform to share some of these findings on a global level. So maybe Christian, that's actually a push to you. Maybe there is a role for WBA. We just had a USIPA board meeting, the United States Industrial Pellet Association, where we're starting a new push on that front, because we're learning, but not fast enough. Lastly, two more things I will say, and then we can go into all sorts of other verticals here. The logistics, you can be the best pellet mill operator or biomass aggregator in the world and lose all the money you think you made in logistics. One of the things we've always found is that if you want to be in the global market, so not in the regional market where Christian started, the 50 kilometers around your plant. If you want to go over an ocean or further distances, scale is incredibly important. I've seen so many developers who are trying to get a 100,000 ton plant to ship across an ocean, and that is really, really difficult, because in order to get the size that you need, you have 4 or 5 months of inventory at the port. That's very expensive from a working capital perspective, which generally gets underestimated. And so scale is really important. For that, you need the appropriate funding. And then lastly, I will say, in terms of key things to watch out for, is customers. We've had, by and large, incredible customer experiences. I just spent the last 12 months renegotiating, 5 million tons of offtake agreements, because the firm made a mistake that Enviva thought, like many others in the industry, that there was going to be inflation, but we did not anticipate 20 or 30% per year. And it's not just inflation; it's all the disruptions that I've talked about, which just piled on. And most of those cost increases haven't disappeared again, right? They're now structural and permanent. So you have an entirely different cost base for many, if not all, of the pellet manufacturers. Certainly the larger scale ones I know. So things have to be different, and so is another good example that hope is not a strategy. An offtake agreement with a customer, when it goes longer term, which often is important for financing purposes, it has to have appropriate mechanisms to address unforeseen circumstances like a war in Ukraine and the pandemic, which created a perfect storm and increased costs quite substantially. Some of the countries did contemplate that, but some of them, particularly to Asia, did not. And that created ultimately a very large problem. So I can certainly go into more detail there. Lastly, I would say, and Christian, you can talk as much about this as I can, we depend on some level of regulation and support from governments. At a minimum, we depend on the fact that the EU ETS sets biogenic carbon to 0. That we have to defend with all we got, because that is ultimately the basis for all of our businesses, one form or the other.
Thanks, Thomas. That was really comprehensive and very very valuable. Maybe just to respond on one point that you mentioned, that is size. I keep we are now, as World Bioenergy Association, also looking very closely on development of supply chains in regions where pellet production has not existed in the past, be it in Asia, be it in Africa. And there is quite often some developers of relatively small plants, like 30,000 tons, that are thinking about selling the stuff to Europe. Everybody wants to sell pellets to Europe because there is an interesting market there. There is an established market, high prices in that market. What would you recommend to these persons?
Well, the one thing that has not happened much in this industry, and that's why I'm intrigued about what I'm going to do next. If you want to sell 30,000 tons to a market, and that's all you make, for example, right? You need a partner. You can't just do it by yourself. And the large trading houses, they trade tens and millions of tons from all over the world. So teaming up with some of the larger trading houses to minimize the logistical challenges and create the necessary credibility and credit for the ultimate customer, I think is something that we have not really developed in this industry, and that's why some of the smaller opportunities haven't been able to enter the market as well. I think that is something that we can change and we should change. But I think my primary answer is you can't do it by yourself.
So it can be done, but don't try to do it yourself.
Yep. Just try to find somebody who's got the expertise in logistics and dealing with large scale customers, because they're complicated, right? Like if you start dealing with a contract with a large utility, like the legal costs of that are the same whether you sell 10,000 tons or 1,000,000 tons, right?
Right. There is a question here. How can company ensure products don't pollute the oceans, the rivers, the lakes, and our environment, all the global? What would you answer to this person?
Well, so when you think about the supply chain, right? We have to be honest. I mean, shipping uses, by and large, bunker fuel that is high in sulfur and cannot be the end all for how we think about environmental pollution, right? We talk about carbon, but those are point emissions. Shipping is one of the more difficult things to clean up, and actually is a perfect example for the potential of circular opportunities here. From biomass is the natural source to create biomethanol, and biomethanol is the natural replacement for bunker fuel. And not only do you have a totally different carbon profile, you also have a different sulfur profile and emissions profile, right? Those are some of the examples. The same is for trucking, whether trucks go electric or they go into a biomass fuel. I think the next 10 years provide incredible opportunities for that. We're certainly early stage, but one of the things why I decided to stay in the biomass industry is because that's the next frontier where technologies are starting to catch up and the demand is certainly real.
Right, thanks. Well, Thomas, that was great. And I think a wonderful lecture for all those guys that want to engage in these huge opportunities. And I share the view that the opportunities are really tremendous, but the challenges are also significant. and learning is the one thing that we as the World Bioenergy Association try to support by inviting guys like you to the table. So thanks a lot for this. And I'll hand now over to Martin Groth. Martin, you have been preparing a presentation on the sweet spot for biomass supply chain. So looking at where are the conditions, which factors need to kind of come together to create good conditions for establishing a biomass supply chain. Martin, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. And I think my slides will underpin what Thomas said. Actually, my background, amongst others, is electrical. So what Thomas was referring to, actually, there was some kind of a bilateral development 15 years ago. And actually, since 5 years now, running my own firm, more focusing on the global south, so Africa and Southeast Asia. So my presentation basically will start with wood pellets as a commodity product. Can everyone see my screen? Christian, could you confirm that?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, good. So what I would like to do is guide you through a few slides, basically providing some data points in reference also to what Thomas indicated, and maybe also building a foundation for Ditsis on his presentation on the supply chain. So very briefly an overview on some high-level steps on a supply chain. I have two supply chains here. The first one is basically what Thomas was referring to. So large scale, in this case, wood pellets for power plant production. So on the left-hand side, we have, well, this myriad of options of feedstock, all the way from sawdust to energy crops to recycled wood, going into the supply chain, being logistically transferred to a site where it's being processed, upgraded, stored, and exported by vessels, in this case, to a large-scale end user, using it for renewable power production. Similar supply chain, but now not globally, more like locally, you could say within that 50-kilometer radius. Similar feedstock, much smaller quantities. So the previous one was like a few 100,000 tons, 500,000 tons. This one is more like the 10 to 30 KT, what Christian was also referring to, or even smaller for that matter. Similar as feedstock, inbound logistics again, processing it into smaller scale pelletization or chipping, storing it locally, mostly in bags when used for advanced biomass cook stoves. And this is more like a global south supply chain, where, for example, in Africa or Southeast Asia, agri-residues or forest residues are used to produce wood pellets to be used locally for advanced cook stoves projects. So just two types of supply chains. We see similar elements, but obviously the scale is quite different, and also the modus of each individual step is quite different. Then just coming back to the large-scale industrial global supply chains, wood pellets, it is just here the top three of the producing countries. And Thomas, you used to be there on that US side, on the left-hand side, your 6 million tons, I think is the major, might even be the majority chunk of the industrial wood pellets being produced. We have Canada and we have Vietnam. And actually Vietnam now being the #2 producer of industrial wood pellets globally. And just a bit of numbers. I mean, the presentation will be shared afterwards, I believe, Christian. So these slides can be shared afterwards with the numbers. This actually is coming from a public tool from Future Metrics. Really great stuff to look in that Sankey diagram and look into the details of annual productions, where you can see that US #1 is about, was it 9.5 million tons of industrial pellets? And #2 is Vietnam with a bit over 4 million, and Canada a runner-up on #3. Just to give you an indication on not only the volume, but also the different markets. You will see a long list of countries. So indeed, those bilateral contracts what Thomas was referring to, that's all to be structured with all of these individual customers in all of these countries. So what you will see is, well, some 3-4 major producing countries, and basically being shipped all over the world to end customers. Primarily, I would say Europe and Japan and South Korea. Well, just to give you an overview that the takeaway of this slide is that building supply chains is really depending on the length of the supply chain and the prices of each of the components in the supply chain. This is a great overview made long time ago by Puri, but I think still valid, which is just giving an indication of various sourcing regions, European, South American, North American, Australia, just to give an overview of each of the cost components in that supply chain. So the dark blue one is feedstock up to the pellet mill. And then we have subsequently, we have inland logistics, we have pelletizing or chipping, we have shipping. The red lines, the short red lines is basically the shipping distance. And what I've highlighted here is Finland versus Canada. The end delivery is CIF, so that's called cost, insurance and freight, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Arnhem, Antwerp. That is the reference point, and just shipping it from Finland to, let's say, Rotterdam versus shipping it from Vancouver, Western Canada, British Columbia to Rotterdam doesn't automatically mean that shipping it from Finland is cheaper. It could be, depending on the modus operandi, that even shipping it from further distance might be at par or even cheaper. So just this reference, what you see is in Finland, we have quite expensive feedstock cost compared to, for example, Canada or Brazil or Chile, for example. Well, shipping it over longer distances does not automatically mean it's more expensive, because in the end, we have much lower shipping costs for Finland, especially if we're going to pelletize it. However, with the feedstock cost and the pelletization cost, Finland in the end is more expensive than pelletizing it in Canada. So the conclusion here is that for Finland, for example, wood pelletization to ship it to Rotterdam is probably not making sense, because the densification of pelletization, basically meaning lower freight cost, is not weighing up by the pelletization cost in Finland. However, in Canada, what you will see is having wood chips basically shipped all the way to Rotterdam is more expensive than pelletizing it first. So you do have the additional pelletization cost, but you have significantly lower freight costs, which is the light gray component. So in the end, the conclusion of this slide is it depends. So structuring the ultimate supply chain, the optimum supply chain, is depending on your source, your route to market, the length of your supply chain, and all of the individual cost components. And I will come to optimizing that supply chain depending on where is your feedstock, where is your catchment area, and where is your end market, and how to structure that optimum supply chain. To do that, I'm working with a lot of clients, a lot of projects on a structure when I'm doing sourcing and origination, that I'm working with a funnel approach, which also works very well to structure the optimum supply chain, the biomass supply chain, which is checking on the availability of products, the sustainability of it, the applicability, meaning what is the fuel specification the end customer can still accept, and can we widen that fuel specification criteria. Affordability, obviously, which is the price, not the price at the wood chipping facility or the feedstock or even free on board, the price basically at the end of the entire supply chain. That is what matters. And there is where the competition is between the various supply chains all the way to the end. And there the affordability is important. And bankability, meaning in the end, the supply chain needs to be structured with credible contracting, with de-risking on technologies, and not introducing too many novices, nothing new here, to make it, let's say, proven to be bankability. And in the end, what we are aiming for is to find that sweet spot of the optimum supply chain, meeting the criteria for the end customer, being an affordable price. So if a price, basically DDU, as we say, delivery duty unpaid. So basically at the end, to be used as heat or power, to be affordable. And to make that affordable, it also needs to be applicable for the end customer. So the fuel specification needs to be applicable, and the customer, as Thomas already indicated, it needs to be reliable. So especially the large scale industrial consumers, they need whatever, 300, 400, 500,000 tons a year, dedicated supply, no default risk. So security of supply is extremely important. And in the end, to meet all those three criteria, there is a conflict of interest here. I mean, if we are looking at, for example, a very tight fuel specification, so extremely low on ash, extremely low on chlorine, for example, that automatically means that the fuel price will increase because you need to debark your product, you need to find very more expensive, higher priced feedstocks to meet that affordability. So applicability and affordability is almost like a contradiction. Same goes with availability. The more feedstock, the higher volumes. You need to tap in other markets. If the low-hanging fruit is gone, you need to tap into maybe whole log chipping, other type of products, which will increase the price. So you need to find that equilibrium of those three elements. And there you will have, as I call it, the sweet spot of meeting all those criteria, obviously within the holistic framework of it being sustainable and bankable. Well, just as an example, this was more like the global north, the industrial wood pellet supply chain, but it could also apply, and it is applying also to other supply chains like agri-residues and wood chips. Now, an example of a global south supply chain of wood chips, of bush chips, where in the end, with that sweet spot and that funnel approach criteria and approach taking into account, is designing a supply chain where the entire supply chain with each of the individual change is being specified and developed, being assessed, and then ultimately per element in the supply chain, whether we go road transport or rail transport, whether we go chipping or pelletizing, that individual optimization might have a impact, positive or negative, upstream or downstream. For example, if you have very specific criteria to pelletize, it will have an impact on upstream, your feedstock criteria for sourcing. But it also might have an impact downstream on how you handle your product. Pelletization, pellets basically is handled differently with more scrutiny than, for example, wood chips. So making a decision on pelletization is having an impact downwards as well, a cost impact, a handling, or the logistical impact. So in the end, it's really about finding the optimum for every element in the supply chain and assessing the impact upstream and downstream, and trying to find that optimum of all the elements as aggregated, meeting all those criteria of that sweet spot. And I'm closing with just an example of bush on farmland as feedstock. What are the steps in the supply chain actually to get it to the ultimate user? I've basically put three sections here. The first section, as I call it, is from bush to chip. So basically having everything structured with the feedstock, the standing feedstock, doing harvesting and chipping, looking after basically soil management, land restoration, and then aggregating it into local hubs, into a central hub, basically logistics, but it's very much feedstock and processing driven. So from bush to chip is what you can say more like forestry activities and land management activities. However, once you have aggregated to a chip, we're basically getting to a different competence from forestry and land management and forestry processing and wood processing, getting into logistics, which is a different competence. So really how to get it most efficiently, best cost, still meeting all criteria, from a chip to ship, basically free on board ship, large scale volumes. So railway, is that an option? Aggregating it, storing it, managing the whole storage process, loading it on a vessel from chip to ship. When it's free on board on a ship, basically you have the freight component, you have the unloading and storage component close to the customer side, to the end user side, and ultimately then it being processed on site if needed, for example, breaking the pellets again and used. So what you can see here is we have so many steps in the supply chain. If one basically step breaks, the entire supply chain breaks. So there are a lot of elements basically where your business case can be screwed by not addressing all the elements. So in the end, it is let's say a quest, an endeavor, having various competences from all the way from forestry, processing, to logistics, to sustainability, to banking. And as Thomas already indicated, there are various ways how it's getting wrong, but we are all still here in the industry trying to make it work, and we have also seen a lot of successes next to some learning lessons we have seen. So by this, handing it back to you, Christian.
Thank you very much, Martin. Now, you have mentioned that you have more recently been looking more to the global south. And I mean, there was also a question from the audience. Is there a way for the youth in the global south to take advantage of what we're talking about? How do you see the opportunities for local developers, be it in Southeast Asia, be it in Africa, to really engage successfully in a business with bioenergy? What's your take? Is the route to go? I mean, what you're showing is really complex. So these global supply chains are very challenging. Would you agree with me that looking for a local use and establishing small-scale local supply chains is probably a better way to start with?
It's a good question, and whether local or global, it depends. I would say I think for both supply chains, so global and local, there is definitely an opportunity for youth involvement. And actually, it's one of the drivers in various African countries where I'm working with. For example, if you compare biomass to green hydrogen, green hydrogen is very capital intensive, very complicated, and actually not generating so much employment locally, especially on the unskilled worker side. Where with biomass, if you're looking at, let's say, the upstream biomass harvesting and processing and aggregating, there is a lot of opportunity for local employment, for youth employment, for unskilled workers to be involved in that supply chain, for SME companies, for example. And we do see a lot of uptake actually in various African countries where I'm working with. I do see that they really value the biomass supply chain as one of the drivers for youth employment. And that can be both ways. That can be a global supply chain. The advantage of a global supply chain is, one, it's getting funded and structured. The uptake for local employment can be massive, can be multiple thousand employees working in a large-scale global supply chain in an African country for export, right? I mean, that will be an export supply chain, just like I indicated this supply chain as an example. Definitely having a lot of impact. Also, from a local perspective, yes, definitely that is of interest. Then, for example, working with small pelletizers or small chippers and using the chips or the wood pellets either for a heating boiler or for cook stoves. Indeed, also working with young people, so addressing unemployment by youngsters, but the scale of impact obviously will be significantly smaller. Then we're looking at maybe 30 to 50 employees in a small project. They can be involved in the downstream side of the supply chain, what we see with cook stoves, for example, in the sales and the maintenance and the distribution of pellets and the sales and maintenance of cook stoves. So you have maybe another 20, 30 per project. So per project of a local supply chain, maybe up to 100 staff, 100 employees. Where if we're looking at the global supply chain and we're looking at, let's say, 100, 300, 400,000 tons, then it can be in the thousands. So yes, it can work for both sides.
Thank you for clarifying that. I mean, there has been a lot of talk about wood. What we did not touch is, of course, there are other options than woody biomass. There are agricultural residues. There are purpose-grown plants, purpose-grown grasses. So there is really a lot more to do with bioenergy than just looking at wood. But the truth is that in the past, the focus has been on wood because it is kind of it has very good quality properties. It's available in abundance and it has very good combustion properties. It's reasonably dense. So there are reasons that wood has been in the focus. I mean, one of the questions was here in the chat, how do we prevent illegally cut wood from entering these supply chains? Martin, what would you say to this? I mean, this is a tremendously important question, obviously.
Yeah, to me, there are two elements. Obviously, very tight certification, but honestly, I don't think tight certification like FSC, PEFC, SAN, and others is not enough. So to me, it should be a combination of very tight sustainability criteria being validated by certification. But on top of that, I think any respectable and responsible off-taker should do a bespoke due diligence on site, and do also be involved in stakeholder management with local actors, especially in the global south, where the risk of illegal deforestation might be higher, which means that there is an increased responsibility. Obviously, the idea is there is still abundance of biomass, whether it's agri residues or dedicated fuel, but it comes with an increased responsibility to avoid this, which means that certification, to me, my advice is certification is not enough. Due diligence, stakeholder management, getting involved locally, getting your foot on the ground, and really understand the local dynamics beyond certification from a desk.
Thanks, Martin. That was very, very valuable. Let's now move over to our last speaker. Ditzis Balais has a lifelong experience in the bioenergy field as a producer, as a trader, as a manager of trade organizations. You're still with the board of Bioenergy Europe. Ditzis, what are the takeaways from your career on developing and running bioenergy supply chains? Floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm really pleased to be here and honored. So indeed, have been working in the biomass industry now since 25 years almost, and have seen and have been working in many positions as a producer and as a trader and as a, let's say, whole supply chain company. And there are many cases, but you know, as previous speakers, both Martin and Thomas, they have mentioned literally most of the topics, and it's hard maybe to find something new to say, but actually the hard truth, if you just in the beginning process, is actually to start with let's say doing your homework, really doing very let's say very detailed market research, and here I mean both sides, because every supply chain you have the two destinations, the origin and then the customer at the end, or consumption at the end. So basically doing your homework, meaning you really research all the supply, starting with the supply and then the supply chain, about the possibilities and options, and also keep in mind that and I think Thomas has been mentioning it, that if at the present moment the biomass which you are looking at in the sourcing region, there is plenty of it and it's cheap or maybe even for free, then it's going to change at some point. And keep that in mind, and build your supply chain to secure your supply, that in case if the situation is changing and new players are coming and competition is coming, so that you are still able to run your supply chain. And so basically I would like to say the second thing is know your cooperation partners, or know your partners. Actually, I maybe should have put the presentation on the screen. It's a very simple one, but just let's say gives the main, I would say, the main guidelines here. So basically, the second thing is know your supplier, know your partner, and this is where Martin has been very well highlighting that. Don't just trust the certifications. Really do your own due diligence. Find out how the supplier is working, because even in Europe, which is probably the most developed biomass supply chain region, there are plenty of situations where, for example, in wood chips production, it is very, very fragmented. The producers are small. They really source in not very reliable ways, the most of them. And to pick the right suppliers, you really need to investigate how they are sourcing their raw material, how sustainable is it? So if all the legal procedures are done, and so that you are not facing the situation where, for example, you have a supplier of cheap pellets, and then you find out that actually those are coming, let's say, for example, from the sanctioned sources. So in this situation in Europe, we are facing and hearing multiple cases where pellets from Russia are leaking into Europe through the ways around it. And if you don't know your supplier and don't know the supply chain, you are actually risking a lot by taking, let's say, on with such a supply chain. And then, focus on raw material. The demand for biomass is growing. That is a key here. Again, to mitigate the risks and to avoid the situation where you might end up, let's say, with some competitors coming and taking your raw material, also look at the possibility of a diversification of the supply. So diversification is actually a really good tool to mitigate the risks, and diversification not just in a biomass sourcing, but also in available services when you build the supply chain. So most likely, I guess in majority of the cases, nobody is covering all the links of the chain by themselves. So you outsource, port companies doing for you the work, trucking companies, shipping companies, and so on and so on. And when you build a supply chain, think of the alternative options. So always, so that you at least have them. You choose obviously the best, but you think about those options and keep them in your mind and renew that, let's say, time to time, depending on your situation. And then as well, for the risk mitigation, keep in mind that there might be some legislation barriers arising. So that is another thing where you need to pay attention. Like, for example, in Europe, the EUDR, the European Deforestation Regulation, now it's postponed, but it was planned that it would come in force from the 1st of January 2025. So that actually might be, let's say, a very serious example where suddenly legislative barriers arising could actually destroy your supply chain, and how to address that and how to do it. So by all of these, let's say, 3 topics at the beginning, you need to build your information base, and where to get that information is, as Christian mentioned, I have been for many years involved in Bioenergy Europe, that is the European Bioenergy Association. And I've been involved in this because I'm passionate about biomass, but also that is an excellent source of information. So look for the associations, like also the World Bioenergy Association does amazing work providing information. So use these organizations in your advantage for gathering the information, for building the networking, building your network and investigating. And also through the associations, you have much more global perspective and view on the market. And then it's also easier to predict or at least try to prognose what could come. So then, and as a final topic for your supply chain building is role of technologies. I would say that actually majority of the supply chains are built quite conservatively, so the old style. But then I see more and more companies who really try to use the new technologies to improve the supply chains, also to prognose what might happen, or at least to make some forecasts based on the volume movements, based on actual time, real-time monitoring of the market, what is happening. So ship flows, volume flows, stocks, and so on and so on. So you consider how you could use technologies. The same AI. I'm not a great expert of AI, but I know a couple of people who really have been working hard on this to implement this in their supply chains. And maybe not yet, but soon it might be actually a very valuable tool to, let's say, keep your supply chains well running. So all in all, yes, main things to finalize, the main things is know the supply chain inside out and try to really foresee the risks and try to mitigate the risks. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ditsis. And I would like to bring a question to the table for you, Ditsis, and that is, can you give an estimate what percentage of biomass now and in 10 years will come from woody biomass, and what will be the role of other feedstocks?
Well, thank you for a really good question, and this is very valid question. So to do a step back, I would say that also by building your supply chain, keep in mind that sustainability requirements are going to grow. And the sustainability requirements most likely will be, let's say, increasing. Currently, the major focus on the sustainability requirements is for woody biomass. But as Christian, you mentioned correctly, the agri-biomass is a very valid source of biomass or bioenergy in the future. And that could be directly the production of energy out of it, or that could be some biochemical production producing, I don't know, second generation biofuels, or for example, biochar and things like that. So agri-biomass is a very important source. In my experience, I also have been working with agri-biomasses, for example, sunflower husk pellets and olive cake and olive cake pellets. As you, Christian, mentioned in the beginning, those are really challenging because of their composition. But if you have the right technologies to use it, it is a really very valid topic and really good idea to do it, to consider that. And that's the future, I guess.
Right. Well, thanks a lot, Ditsis. I think we're coming to the end of our webinar. I would like to thank all the participants and also the presenters for their contributions. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Ditsis. Thank you, Martin. And thanks to all of you. Be aware that this webinar will be posted on the website of the World Bioenergy Association within a few days. So you will find both the recording of the webinar as well as the slides that we have shown to you. Thanks for joining and hope to see you in our next events. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.